Hello, very warm welcome to you on this autumnal evening. I'm Professor Bridget Byrne, Director of Code, the Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the first session in this conference organised with the Stuart Hall Foundation, Racial Inequality in Times of Crisis. While COVID-19 highlighted and exacerbating long-standing racial and ethnic inequalities in the UK across a range of social arenas, the ensuing crisis in living standards, the criminalising of protests could further entrench these inequalities. As the pandemic wanes, we are thrust deeper into the confluence of crises: governmental inertia in response to the cost of living crisis and climate change, and a coordinated attack on the civil right to protest by the state's policing crimes, sentencing and courts bill. While COVID-19 threw existing inequalities into sharp relief, these crises continue to disproportionately impact the lives of society's most vulnerable people. The conference Racial Inequality in a Time of Crisis is a week-long event online exploring the impact of present-day crises on ethnic minority people in the UK. The event will take place online each day at 5 p.m. from Monday to Thursday this week and is hosted through the partnership between the Stuart Hall Foundation and the Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity, Code. At Code, for the conference, we've invited researchers and practitioners working across the fields of sociology, history, art, media, activism, politics and healthcare to take part in a series of live online presentations and discussions that focus on a number of areas impacted by COVID-19 and the ensuing crisis. Today's education and policing, tomorrow activism, Wednesday housing, and Thursday healthcare. Just to tell you a little bit about Code, the Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity. It's a research centre based at the University of Manchester, but bringing together colleagues from 6 universities across the UK, funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. Our current research programme looking at COVID, race and ethnic inequality seeks to provide a rapid response to the crisis posed by COVID and its social and cultural and economic impact on racial and ethnic minorities. We're a multidisciplinary team using a range of different methods and seeking to provide robust evidence on the often lethal impact of racial and ethnic discrimination and inequality. We aim to provide new data in accessible formats to champion policy and institutional change by showing where and how racial inequality is present, how it builds on and extends existing patterns of inequality, and how this is experienced in everyday lives. We're very clear that the impact of racial and ethnic discrimination and disadvantage are not one-off events, but processes that happen across the life course and across all aspects of the lives of individuals and communities. We want to understand those processes, but also working with a range of partners, we want to think about how communities are challenging discrimination and disadvantage, particularly in the wake of Black Lives Matter. So we're very pleased to be working with the Stuart Hall Foundation, which was established in 2015 by Professor Stuart Hall's family, friends and colleagues. The Foundation's committed to public education, addressing urgent questions of race and inequality in culture and society through talks and events, and building a growing network of Stuart Hall Foundation scholars and artists in residence. They work collaboratively to forge creative partnerships in the spirit of Stuart Hall, thinking together and working towards a racially just and more equal future. At Code, we're really pleased to have this partnership with the Stuart Hall Foundation. We take on Stuart Hall's call for the aim of academic research on race and racism to be to change the world by challenging racial injustice and discrimination. So I'm very pleased that we're opening this 4-day event with a panel titled Education and Policing, where we're going to examine tonight the ways in which educational institutions in particular have become entangled with policing practices, drawing more young racialised minorities into the purview of the criminal justice system, which it is well established has unequal racial outcomes. The session will explore the connections between education and policing and the challenges of working on anti-racism in the current context. This panel will explore this current conjuncture, which of course has parallels with the classic study Policing the Crisis, published by Stuart Hall and others in 1978, which provided a groundbreaking new way of studying policing and race relations, tracking the ways in which the moral panic around racialised figure of the mugger paved the way for authoritarian policing of Black communities. So I'm going to introduce you to the panellists who I believe are going to provide fascinating insights into this question. We have Remi, Joseph-Salisbury. I hope their videos will come on in a second. Zahra and John Holmwood. They're each going to speak for about 10 minutes and then we'll have a panel discussion. Just to briefly introduce them, Remi Joseph-Salisbury, who's going to speak first, is a member of Code and a senior lecturer in sociology at the University of Manchester. His work focuses primarily on racism and anti-racism in the context of education and policing. And he's a steering group member of the Northern Police Monitoring Project and part of the No Police in Schools campaign. Zahra is a PhD student at UCL Institute of Education in London, researching race, racism and education, and school exclusions, disabilities, and the school-to-prison nexus. Zahra describes herself as a recovering teacher with 20 years in the classroom, both in mainstream secondary education and alternative provisions in London. She's a community organiser and, importantly, the co-founder of No More Exclusions and the Coalition of Anti-Racist Educators, CARE. John Holmwood is Professor Emeritus at the School of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Nottingham. He served as an expert witness for the defence in misconduct cases brought against teachers accused of the plot to Islamicise schools in Birmingham. Together with Teresa O'Toole, he's author of Countering Extremism in Birmingham Schools, The Truth About the Birmingham Trojan Horse Affair. And with Dr. Layla Atilhaj, he is the co-director of the People's Review of Prevent. So we're going to have short presentations from the speakers, and then there'll be a panel discussion, and then there's an opportunity for me to put questions that you've raised to the speakers. So if you, at any point during the presentations, if you want to type your questions into the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and then I can put the questions to the panelists. But we're going to start with Dr. Remi Salisbury, who's going to take over. So if the rest of us turn off our cameras.
Good evening, everybody. Really pleased, thanks for the introduction, Bridget. I'm really pleased to share a panel with John and Zahra, who I know that as well as writing and speaking on these issues, have been really active in resisting some of the issues we're going to talk about tonight. The issue I wanted to focus on specifically, at least for this 10 minutes, is that of policing schools. And this is an issue that's gained significant attention recently, specifically following the despicable police strip search of a 15-year-old Black girl at a school in Hackney, which has since come to be referred to as the Child Q case, described by Professor Gus John as state-sanctioned rape of a minor. The public outcry and media attention to that case was entirely justified, but it's important to understand that that wasn't an isolated case, as people like Zahra reminded us at the time. And that's true on a range of levels, most broadly in terms of police racism, but more specifically in terms of the intersection of police racism and police sexism, and more specifically still in terms of the use of strip search against young people, and related to my focus here with regards to the harm caused by police in schools. Now, other stories have broken into the news cycle in recent years. For example, when a video circulated showing a Merseyside police officer, a school liaison officer to be precise, intimidating and assaulting a 10-year-old autistic boy as he lay on the floor. Or the 12-year-old Black mixed race boy who was spoken to by an officer because of a false claim that he'd stolen a cookie. Or when the family of a Black autistic boy brought legal action against the Met Police for its failure to comply with the public sector equality duty in relation to police in schools. But again, these are really just a visible tip of a problem that's far bigger than I think most of us realise. So to give just a little bit of historical context, emphasis on a little bit, relationships between police and schools have a really long history, longer than I think is often acknowledged. In the 1950s, was a moral panic over British youth, which led to police liaison work targeting young people. But it's important to say that this moral panic interacted with another moral panic around Britain's Black communities, and that ensured that the concern over British youth from the outset was often a concern about Britain's Black youth. And in the 60s and 70s, that directly led to police working with and having direct access to school. It was in 2002, however, that police began to be placed directly in schools as part of New Labour's tough on crime agenda. And more recently, specifically in the last 6 years or so, and coinciding with Conservative government plans to build more prisons, introduce more police and give police unprecedented power, there have been several high-profile calls to put more police in schools, often purportedly to tackle youth violence. So among others, these calls have come from Andy Byrne as Mayor of Greater Manchester, Sadiq Khan as Mayor of London, Cressida Dick, the Children's Commissioner, and the Home Affairs Committee. Across the political spectrum of mainstream politics, at least, there seems to be consensus that police should be in schools. And it's worth saying that Corbyn's Labour Party also didn't oppose police in schools. A count by The Guardian in 2021 found that there are nearly 700 police working in schools, but this is almost certainly a chronic undercount that doesn't reflect, one, how many schools are affected, which is to say that those 700 officers, many of them are working across several schools. Two, it doesn't account for the increase in the last year since that data was collected, and we know there has been a significant increase. And three, it doesn't reflect the presence of police in schools in less formal arrangements, such as community police who regularly spend time in schools as part of their rounds, but wouldn't be counted in the count by The Guardian. And despite this bleak trajectory, there's a really strong and growing opposition to police in schools from a range of community groups, as well as some critical academic work. Part of that, alongside groups like No More Exclusions, and you'll see Zahra as part of this picture on the slide, is the No Police in Schools campaign, which is based in Greater Manchester. And it's a group of us, including young people, teachers, academics, parents, activists, and community members, that came together and launched a campaign in 2020. And as part of that work, we conducted some research. Laura Connolly, Roxy Lagan, and myself, with support from others. And we surveyed 554 people in Greater Manchester, included teachers, parents, young people, and community members. And we wrote a report called Decriminalise the Classroom. And given that the plans of those in power were ideologically rather than evidence-driven, this instantly became by far the most substantive research on the topic. And whilst merely looking at the evidence on institutional racism in policing, on the one hand, and institutional racism in education, on the other hand, I think should be enough to indicate to us the harms caused by police in schools. I just briefly want to point out some of the issues, just a few of the issues that we found through that survey regarding police in schools. So the first pertains to the exacerbation of existing inequalities, and this really operates on two levels. First, between schools. So we know that school-based police officers are not placed in all schools. They're more likely to be placed in schools with a higher proportion of working class young people and a higher proportion of students of colour. So from the outset, the impact of police in schools is unevenly felt. But there's more to that picture because we see the exacerbation of existing inequalities within schools. So evidence from young people in particular that responded to the survey suggests that officers act in ways that discriminate against students of colour and particularly Black students. You'll see there on a slide a young person who said there was a police officer that was part of the staff at the high school I attended, disliked by most students due to the more prominent attention they gave to students of colour. And in addition to Black and Asian students, concerns were also raised about the negative impact on disabled students, LGBTQ students, Gypsy Roma traveller students, and women and girls, those who often already face issues with the police in wider society. The second issue, briefly, this pertains to the stigmatisation of schools and low expectations that derive from that. So a significant proportion of those that responded to the survey suggested that schools with a school-based police officer will be stigmatised as a consequence of that. And as a consequence of that, those who attend those schools will also be subject to that stigma, as will the community that surrounds the schools. You'll see there in the image that 70% of the young people that responded said that schools with a school-based police officer face a particular stigma. And that ties in with a culture of low expectations, which has been a long-standing issue with regards to race and class and schools. But it takes on a particular character here, as the message of placing police in schools is perhaps that young people are not expected to have high academic achievement, but are expected to engage in behaviour that requires a penal or punitive response from the police. And that can have really devastating consequences. Third, and I know I'm moving through these quickly, but the third is a climate of hostility. The presence of police in schools can create a climate of hostility. It can create a sense of fear and anxiety amongst young people, as many said in their responses, and it can negatively impact upon student well-being and mental health, particularly for those from minoritized and marginalized communities. And that's really a crucial point at a time when young people are facing a whole range of challenges with regards to mental health. And fourthly, many of those that responded concerned about how school-based police officers exacerbate the risk of minor disciplinary procedures escalating quite quickly into criminal justice issues, into punitive issues. To put simply, police in schools feed a school to prison pipeline. They create or intensify a link between schools and the criminal justice system, and eventually our prisons. And the presence of police in schools means that issues that would be best tackled through supportive mechanisms, perhaps counselling, mentoring, mental health support, are increasingly becoming the purview of the police, an institution ill-equipped to deal with the issues that many young people face. Okay, so just to offer a few final points before I pass on, because some of these are critical and complicate some of what I've just said, I think. So, as I've said, not all police in schools are school-based police officers. We have to understand that to understand how stark the problems are that we face. Also, not all policing in school is done by police. If we think about policing more expansively, that brings the role of teachers into the picture. We know that teachers, head teachers, have the ability, have the right to search young people's bags and to authorise other teachers to do that. So policing-like behaviour is performed by others. We need to keep that in mind when we propose alternatives. So if we want to suggest that instead of police, we want more teachers, we need to think about the role that teachers play as well in perpetuating harm against young people in schools. And I just wanted to point out that police in schools is an international problem. It's an issue in Canada and it's an issue in the United States, but it's being resisted internationally too. There's been some really excellent victories in the US recently and in Canada too. And I think the removal of police from schools can be seen as a step towards police abolition or part of defunding the police. And lastly, resistance is really growing quickly and it's connected to other movements such as the abolition of Prevent and school exclusions. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Remi. And if, as I said before, if you want to put any questions in the Q&A below, we'll come back to them. Now I'd like to introduce Zahra Bey. If you want to turn your video on, Zahra. Great, thank you.
Thank you very much, Bridget. And thanks so much, Remi, for that presentation. You covered so much there. Makes my talk a lot easier. although the subject isn't easy at all. And I wanted to say thanks to everyone that's organised this event and the whole series, and everyone that's joining. Important critical conversation, and I'm so glad it's starting with education. That's often overlooked. So it was only last month that I had amazing experience of being able to be in the presence of Arundhati Roy at the Stuart Hall Foundation, Conway Halls, and it is often her words on the pandemic and also the words of Gloria Ladson-Billings that I go back to when I touching on the shores of despair, and in particular on these words. Our minds are still racing back and forth, looking for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future to our past and refusing to acknowledge the rapture. But the rapture exists, and in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we've built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. And I complete that, if that even needs completion, with Gloria Ladson-Billings' words that normal is where the problems reside, and education needs a hard reset. And I want everyone to kind of have those words kind of lingering in the air throughout this little intervention I'm going to make, because I really think that the opening and the rapture of this period is where our intervention can be the most powerful. So I want to talk very briefly about NME for anyone that's not familiar. So NME is 4 years old. It literally started at my kitchen table with some of the students that I used to teach at a pupil referral unit in East London, where I taught for nearly 10 years. And it came about during a period of, as often these things, of crisis, more crisis. And the crisis at that time, as we saw it, was the fact that the majority of the teachers, the educators at the PRU would be made redundant on the auspices of austerity. There was threat of academization or turning the PRU into a free school. And also there was the fact that we were expanding. We were seeing increasing numbers, particularly of girls coming through, particularly of children with special needs and disability. And we just didn't have the capacity. So in the midst of all of that, there was a conference that happened at South Bank University that I attended with other colleagues, other teachers, Black educators actually, that would also be made redundant. And I remember listening to Professor Gus John. I remember listening to Imran Khan, the lawyer of the Stephen Lawrence family. I remember listening to Inquest. I remember listening to Katrina French and Stop and Search. I remember listening to Kende Andrews. And it was actually Temi Mwale was there as well from Forefront, and many more. Safford Scott and so on. And I remember as an educator thinking, well, how do I fit into all of this? And the title of that conference resonates in my mind to this day. It was State Racism, Collusion and Resistance. And I really got stuck on the collusion part. I really felt as an educator, I was colluding, whether it was intentionally or unintentionally, really not important, right? Outcome is what matters, the impact of our actions, what matters. So that's really how NME came to be. There was a call to action made at that conference and 54 people came forward, and NME was kind of born there and then. And although it's 4 years old, it does build on a long history of resistance on school exclusions, including, I've just mentioned, this is going to be the third time that we're mentioning Gus John, but the Black Parents Movement of the 60s and 70s, Bernard Cord, Jessica and Eric Huntley, and so many others. And also, this is all being documented as well in Heart of the Race as well, that this is not a new struggle. It's certainly not a new struggle, what NME is trying to do. But I think the language of abolition is perhaps what we are uncompromising about, and the language of refusal. Because for us, going back to the title of policing and education, we really have felt as educators, and I want to focus on them a little bit, especially because Remi has mentioned the role of the educator with, you know, how policing manifests through the education, in education system. And what I know happens in the course of the job is that you have policing of the classroom, policing of corridors, policing of toilets, policing of uniforms, policing of hair, policing of bodily functions, policing, all of this happening along race, gender, disability, and class lines. You have policing of families, you have policing of cultures, you have policing of smells, you have policing of language, both verbal and non-verbal. You have policing of stairs, you have policing of the urban child. We have broken glass policing ideology that's been applied to education through zero tolerance and no excuses behavior policies that we know reproduce racial inequities. We have on-site police officers, police patrolling outside school gates. We have police picking up children not in school. We have other forms of state surveillance, like Prevent, that John is going to talk about. We have the policing of postcodes, the gangs matrix in London and Excalibur in Manchester. We're talking about policing through the curriculum. We're talking about policing through labeling. We're talking about, going back full circle, the policing of what normal is. And I wanted to finish off with, and I'm so glad that Remi talked about childcare, because I do still find it difficult to talk about that case, because it was, once again, it was the teachers that called the police on that child who was in an exam, menstruating, without an appropriate adult present. And I just wanted to finish my little presentation with her words, actually. Someone walked into the school where I was supposed to feel safe, took me away from the people who were supposed to protect me, and stripped me naked while on my period, on top of preparing for the most important exams of my life. I can't go a single day without wanting to scream, shout, cry, or just give up. I feel like I'm locked in a box and no one can see or cares that I just want to go back to feeling safe again. My box is collapsing around me and no one wants to help. I don't know if I'm going to feel normal again. I don't know how long it will take to repair my box, but I do know this can't happen to anyone ever again. All the people that allow this to happen need to be held responsible. I was held responsible for a smell. Thank you very much, Bridget.
Thank you, Zahra. Yeah, I'm sure it's difficult to read and difficult to hear. I'm now going to introduce John Holmwood, who's going to speak, as Zahra said, about Prevent. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak at such an important initiative and series of events this week. I want to begin with what Stuart Hall set out in his analysis of authoritarian populism in the 1980s, because it's a term that applies equally to our own times. And if anything, things have got significantly worse. One of his interests was the role of local resistance and social movements, for example, of movements equivalent to Black Lives Matter in our own time. But local resistance now takes place in a very different environment in England. It's an environment in which local democracy has been very substantially eroded. This is a consequence of the marketisation and outsourcing of local government services, which has proceeded apace since Stuart Hall wrote. I'll discuss it in the context of education in particular, because the government recently introduced a schools bill. It's currently on hold, in which it was proposed that by 2030, all schools should be removed from local authority control, that is, from local democratic involvement, and be part of a multi-academy trust. Now, currently, 75% of secondary schools and 25% of primary schools in England are academies and outside local authority involvement. This is an extraordinary centralisation of power, because all agencies responsible for schools, the oversight of schools in England, are now part of the Department for Education. For example, the Education Funding Agency responsible for academies and free schools, Ofsted, and the Teacher Regulation Agency. And education services for academies are already provided by private, for-profit and charitable consultancies. And the government has also announced in the schools bill a new body to provide national online curriculum resources, a Oak Academy Trust, a charity, but linked to fairly right-wing groups. It wasn't always like that, and some people will have very positive experiences of it during COVID, but Oak Academy Trust has been transformed in the process of being identified as this new body. In the proposed legislation for schools, the only duty on councils would be to maintain a register to identify children not in school. And there are several pilots underway to electronically monitor children on a daily and hourly basis, an extraordinary surveillance. Now, in my brief presentation, I want to discuss how this intersects with developments in the government's counter-extremism strategy Prevent. Since 2015, all schools, along with other public services, have had a duty to monitor their pupils for signs of radicalisation. Those identified to be at risk are interviewed by local counter-terrorism police and Prevent officers, usually without the presence of parents or a responsible adult. Obviously not as traumatic as the experience of child Q, but nonetheless a very isolating and frightening experience for many children. From there, they may be reported to a local Prevent panel for further evaluation and consideration for intervention through what's called the Channel Programme of Education Support. But only around 5% of all referrals reach this threshold. For the rest, no action is taken, except that their information is retained on police databases. We've just seen today that Metropolitan Police Chief Sir Mark Rowley declared that 1,000 young black men should be removed from the gang violence database because they pose no risk. Prevent operates in a similar way of gathering data which is potentially available to police forces and other agencies. Now, around 30% of Prevent referrals are from schools. And I use the 2017-18 data because that's the last pre-COVID data that's available. Otherwise, the numbers have fallen because of schools being closed. But in 2017-18, children under 15 made up 27% of all referrals. And young people aged 15 to 20 made up a further 29% of all referrals. Prevent then is primarily directed at young people and operates at all levels of education from kindergarten upwards. It's like Stop and Search. It operates entirely in the pre-criminal space. And it's important to recognize that there is nothing illegal about the attitudes and behaviors that give rise to someone being reported. Even that small number, that 5% of the total, where a channel intervention is recommended, they have committed no offence, nor declared any intention to commit an offence. So, stress that any ideas deemed to be extremist under Prevent are not illegal and no offence is committed or intended. Now, Prevent is primarily focused on Muslim communities. For example, the government has identified 44 special Prevent priority areas about which little information is released. However, within our People's Review of Prevent, we accidentally got a positive response to one Freedom of Information request from one local authority where we discovered all the Prevent priority areas. And one could identify from that around 3/4 of Muslims in England reside in a Prevent priority area, compared with around 1/3 of the population as a whole. And in effect, this means that ethnic minorities, and not simply Muslim ethnic minorities, more broadly, are much more likely to live in a Prevent priority area than the white population of England. But we can speak of Prevent not only as a net drawn through populations of young people, but also as an ethos that determines school cultures. Since late 2014, and also linked to Prevent, all schools have been required to promote fundamental British values and to do so as a whole school approach, and for that to be monitored through Ofsted inspections. The values identified are democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, mutual respect, and tolerance of different religious faiths and beliefs. But there are several key things to notice. First, despite academy schools being exempt from the national curriculum, a new national curriculum has been introduced by the back door, the securitized curriculum of Prevent and Fundamental British Values. And second, while the values that are identified might be argued to underpin multiculturalism, that's what the Byrne report suggested back in 2000, their designation as British values betrays the fact that they involve an othering of ethnic minorities and a presumption that they need to be inculcated in British values while normalizing the prejudices of the majority. But there's a further problem. The definition of extremism as a floating category is primarily directed at Muslim communities, but it's also directed at any groups opposing government policy. And in the light of the recent police courts and sentencing act that Bridget mentioned in the introduction, those recommending direct action, such as Extinction Rebellion, Greenpeace, or Black Lives Matter, are also identified as extremists. Indeed, curriculum guidance from the Department for Education warns schools against using curriculum material from such organisations, with the Home Secretary herself declaring her hostility to wokeness and stating that not that racism is a form of extremism, but that anti-racism is a form of extremism that promotes divisiveness. So schools are required to pay due regard to safeguarding children from radicalisation, and that's part of Prevent. But they've also been required since 2010 to pay due regard to promoting equalities. Yet this has been systematically downgraded by the Department for Education, and the very bodies that would have promoted equalities, local authorities with significant ethnic minority populations, have lost their powers. In tandem with this, government has increased its central control over civil society organisations. People may have read recently in the leaks of the forthcoming Shawcross report that the think tank Policy Exchange has recently recommended that the Home Office should establish a register and certification of Muslim civil society organisations with which national and local governments and those funded by them can engage. And in this form of authoritarianism, we can expect a likely next step to be to extend that to other civil society and political organisations. So if we return to where I started in discussion of Stuart Hall's ideas of authoritarian populism, we can see that Prevent is a form of surveillance directed at children and young people, but it also acts as a form of disciplining of ethnic minority and minority religious teachers and professionals within schools, limiting what can be taught and subjecting the curriculum to political control and authorizing private academy trusts which no longer operate in the interests of the communities in which schools operate. And this is one of the reasons why in the People's Review of Prevent, we've called for the abolition of Prevent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. If Remi and Zahra, if you want to come back on. And we're going to have a brief discussion between the panel and then turn to the questions from the audience. There's already some coming in, but if you want to put them in the Q&A tab below, that's the place to put the questions. I suppose I had two questions that immediately arose to me, which I'll tell you both so you've got time to think about them. And one is, to ask a bit more in detail about the ways in which gender features, because I think it runs across all your presentations in terms of how the racialization of particular gendered behaviours are being disciplined or not, and how that works. And then to ask maybe a more difficult question, I don't know, to think about, well, if we think, as Zahra kind of challenged us to sort of rethink the norm and draw a clean slate, and if we were to think about, rather than focusing on the harms, but think about education as a place of safety and care, how would we imagine that? I suppose, you know, it's about the parts of that agenda of abolition is to do some reimagining, and so to think about how that might happen. So I don't know if anyone wants to volunteer to start on the gender question. If nobody volunteers, I'm picking Remi.
Well, I can come in because I think the issue around British values is a particular kind of authoritarian liberal values, which is frequently reflected through gender, and particularly as it's directed towards Muslim communities. The assumption of conservatism and the assumption of oppressive actions and patriarchy, within the community, and therefore a suspicion about normative Muslim behaviour in relation to schools. So in the Birmingham Trojan Horse case, one of the continual questions that was asked of girls by the inspectors was, who forces you to wear the hijab? There could be no understanding that the hijab was voluntary, and indeed, even the fact that a significant proportion of the girls at the school did not wear the hijab was not taken as any indication that it was voluntary, and reflected the agency of the pupils themselves as they negotiated their own identities and sense of who they were as Muslims and British pupils in Birmingham.
Yeah, indeed, the separation of genders was considered contentious despite the widespread existence of single-sex schools.
Yeah, but even also of sort of standard behaviours of young people sitting together in all-boy, all-girl groups and so on. So at those schools, you are now broken up if you're sitting in single-sex groups. So it becomes that things which are a normal pattern of adolescent school life are just considered and looked at for indications of a problematic, understanding of gender roles. Yeah.
In terms of policing schools, I guess, like policing more generally and like racism more generally operates in ways that are racist and sexist and impact upon, for example, Black women and girls in particular ways. In that report that I mentioned, there were examples of school-based police officers making sexist comments to young women, young girls at school, victim blaming type comments, a whole host of examples of specific forms of discrimination, also targeted at LGBTQ communities. In the US, where there's a much larger body of literature on this, there's a range of examples of sexist violence, for example. And one, this is slightly shifting away from the question, but it is relevant, thinking about gender. Something that's often you will hear in some discussions is that we could have women police officers in school. We could have people of colour as the police officers in schools. But the evidence from that survey and what we know from critical work on policing more generally really pushes us to challenge that thinking. And some of the most severe examples of racism and sexism in the report come from women police officers in schools. I'm not going down a path of saying that women police officers are worse than men, but just to challenge that kind of simplistic thinking that if we just change the identity of the police officer, that will cover up all the institutional problems with the police force. Yeah, it's a difficult question actually, because sexism is so deeply ingrained in policing, and everything that they do operates in gendered ways. It's often hard to pinpoint it, but I think we need to do that work more and more.
Thanks, Remi. I was also interested in a way about how boys are targeted as well, because there is a disproportionality as well, isn't there, in terms of police searches in school. But Zahra, I don't know if you had something to add.
So much to be said about gender, to be honest, the ways in which policing manifests in relation to boys, girls, and beyond the binary. I was thinking about, for example, when we wrote, what about the other 29 and other frequently asked questions? The question of, we need, what are we going to do with sexual violence if we don't exclude, right? And this idea that whenever we are challenging race, the over-exclusion of Black boys, there is this evoking of the girl that has to be protected from the supposedly Black predators, this traditional racist trope, right? And images of Emmett Till always come to my mind when that is invoked. And no one ever asks, some people purport to speak on behalf of the majority, the other 29, right, that we are trying to keep safe. But no one's actually asked them, what do you want to be done in school in relation to sexism and gender-based violence? And do you think, as children and young people directly affected, that exclusion resolved that? And we found in the course of our work, speaking to young people directly affected who are in education now or have left education since, that question has never been put to them. So there is a lot of work to be done. There are new questions, more nuanced questions that have to be asked as part of challenging the norm, that I really think have to put gender at the core without ventriloquizing for children and young people, hearing it directly from them. Like I hope I was able to do a little bit with the words of Child Q, where she didn't ask, in her own words, was asking for people to be held responsible for the sexual violence that she endured at the hands of the state and at the hands of her teachers, actually. That's sexual violence that we need to address and we don't talk about enough in my mind.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone wants to add to that, or if anyone cares to venture on the question of how would we reimagine education and schools as a place of safety and care.
But I will have it because it really points to the issue that Zahra raised about collusion and resistance, and it's a difficult question to ask teachers to resist, because what they wish to do is get on with teaching pupils and do the best for their pupils. So collusion is already part of being a teacher. That is helping to secure a well-functioning and positive school. So the thing that for me was a mark of really great sadness was to say, well, the school at the centre of the Birmingham Trojan Horse affair was a successful school that made its pupils feel safe. It had previously featured in a really terrible panorama program, The Underclass in Purda, where hardly any of the children at the school were successful. It had turned around and become incredibly successful and had done so by making children in what was one of the most deprived areas in Birmingham safe and successful. So actually what the school was doing was my recommendation of what a successful school should do and how should we respond to it. They were encouraging the children to bring their whole self to school, to express their cultural identities, to express their religious identities, and to be successful in the terms of the orientation of schooling towards achievement and so on. That school was brought down despite it being a model of integration. The fact that other educators went to speak to them about how and what should be done was an indication of a plot, of a network of plotters and sinister people. And it seems to me that that kind of othering the participation of ethnic minorities, that kind of liberal anxiety and liberal hostility is one of the really serious problems that we have. I mean, religious minorities, ethnic minorities are by and large much more tolerant of each other. They live in multi-ethnic spaces. The group that is intolerant and hostile to religious expression are white middle-class liberals like myself, and we live segregated lives. I mean, it's as if everything is turned upside down, and what enables it is the way in which power has become concentrated and centralized, and particular kinds of professionals presenting themselves as leaders and consultants and so on can organize in that way through the academy's system. So I'm sort of pessimistic about overcoming the government, but I'm completely optimistic about the fact that there are teachers and others with the skills and commitments to do something about it if they were given more of a free rein to do so.
Thank you. I don't know whether it means also redefining what a successful school is, perhaps. I don't know if Remi or Zahra have anything to say on that.
Yeah, it's really, I'm really glad we have this question, because I think what we're all talking about in different ways is some form of abolition, and abolition is often mistaken, sometimes deliberately misconstrued, as being about just tearing everything down. But if we read the work on abolition from the outset, it's about imagining, it's about what we can build. And you know, that's really there at the heart of the work, even if it's not immediately suggested by the word abolition. So it is really important that we remember that. And on the one hand, it's an incredibly difficult question, because I think our schools are so far away right now from what we would imagine if we were free. But at the same time as saying that, I think there are pockets in our society where we can maybe see some of this. So I'm thinking about the kind of summer schools that some community groups put on, the alternative forms of education outside of mainstream school. And when we looked at those spaces, having been at Kids of Colour summer school just last summer, what we see is drastically different than what's going on in schools. And to give some examples, you know, we often see smaller class sizes, or multiple teachers, or an ethos of seeing everyone in the room as a potential teacher and a potential learner. A lot more freedom from a really prescriptive curriculum, a range of age ranges working side by side, and often letting the young people take things in a direction that they choose. But the other thing to say, I think, is that imagination is an ongoing process. So we might imagine a few things to start with, but it would constantly be changing and adapting along the way as we're all contributing to it. That's thinking about schooling. I guess the abolition of policing more broadly is another question that we might come to later.
Zahra, I don't know if you want to come in on that.
The question of what can we do with schools?
Yeah, or how, I mean, I wondered whether I imagine you've had conversations with young people about how they would reimagine education to be a place of equality and safety.
Yes, that's a conversation that we have ongoing. I think we've come to the point often, the standstill position of do we need schools for education as they're currently set out? So yeah, we haven't resolved that yet. Some of us feel like they could be saved, schools could be saved for the sake of saving education. Others feel that actually we don't need walls for education, that we don't need the system that we have now is definitely obsolete and it needs a completely dismantle. And certainly because of the academization, because of privatization, because of there's a real need to reclaim schools as public space, for community space, as a community space of reimagining that are de-hierarchical, that are community centers and where children and young people have a say in the curriculum, they have a say in pedagogy, they have a say in assessment, they have a say in whether they have rewards and sanctions at all. For example, I want to shout out some schools that are doing things differently that give me a great deal of hope. Like, for example, Barrowford School in Lancashire, and I want to shout out the head teacher, Rachel, and also the new school in South London, and also Nadine Bernard, also in South London as well. These are teachers that are trying to do things differently, sometimes within the context of academies, actually, sometimes within different contexts, but trying to resist, refuse, not collude, and engage in that process of humanizing every child, which is really should be at the core, and humanizing every educator, because I think educators are also an oppressed group in many ways, as well as children and young people.
Bridget, can I just add something as well? Just thinking there, often when we think about reimagining, we're often asked for, if you're saying you don't want police in schools, what do you want? And perhaps the most obvious response, which I don't necessarily disagree with, is we want more teachers instead. We can lower class sizes. We want mental health support. We want counselling services. And a lot of the people who responded to our survey said that they would rather see these things than police. And I don't see any problem with that. But I think the complexity we have to add to our arguments around that, and I kind of touched on this on the presentation, but only briefly, is that we can't assume that teachers are anti-racist and teachers can't cause harm. We can't assume that mental health services don't reproduce harms, and harms that parallel policing as well. And often, if we're asking for social workers as another example, we can't ignore the harms that those institutions cause as well. So I guess we have to push our imagination even further, or at least make sure that we're always insisting on those caveats as well, because it goes without saying, or it should go without saying, there are some amazing anti-racist teachers out there, head teachers and teachers that are really committed to this work and really part of the resistance to some of the things that we're talking about.
I think we've had a lot of questions come in, so I will turn, unless there's anything more you want to add, I will turn to some of the questions. Marius Taber asks, are the schools who are demanding is it asking about the presence of police in schools? So where's the demand come from? So is it from schools? or is it local authorities? So where does the different impulses come from?
Zahra, you know, you might know better than me on this, so please jump in if necessary. I think often the impetus is coming from head teachers specifically. A lot of teachers in the less senior positions, my sense is, are opposed to this. And there's evidence of that. There's several of the NEU branches in Greater Manchester and elsewhere that have come out specifically against policing schools. But the head teacher's word, which is often misrepresented as saying the school wants this, it's often the head teacher wants this. And we've seen it happening. It's happening locally in Manchester at the moment, that a police officer is being introduced to a school, parents, young people, and most of the teachers have not been consulted and now are incredibly concerned about it. But because the teachers pushed for it, it's being ploughed ahead with. There's a more complicated answer that the budgets often lie within policing budgets. So for schools, it's either, if you want an extra body in the school, an extra adult, it's either a school-based police officer or no one. You can't have that money. That money doesn't transfer to education, you know, unless social movements make that money shift away from policing. But I think often some head teachers just, you know, want an extra adult.
Do you want to add anything, Zahra?
I was just thinking about the years I spent at the Peru, and the whole time I was there, we had police presence every day of the week. And it becomes normalized. And I was just trying to think, where did it come from? And I think it comes, I have to go back to Stuart Hall and moral panics. And the moral panics of our time is gang violence and knife crime, right? And where do we find the gang members and the ones that hold the knives, right? They've got to be, you know, somewhere. And they've usually can be found at in the people referral unit or alternative provisions or in urban schools, right? That's what's been sold. That's the moral panic. That is the, that's the discourse has been normalized. It certainly was normalized during inset, during training, you know, that we received, you know, every 6 months, for example, we would get a police officer that would come in plain clothes and deliver training on the gangs matrix and describe to us with a map of the local area, you know, which color coded, which gang, you know, populated which part of the borough, and what are their strategies and what are their techniques and what do they do, and thereby criminalize entire neighborhoods, entire families, entire communities, right? And so once you have that, plus you have what's going on in the media, what's, you know, which is a really big part of the discourse of how discourse is reproduced. It's really difficult to then present challenges to that. Because what I'm trying to say is I almost don't know where that wisdom comes from because of the normalization, the meta narrative that is normalized. I don't know if that makes sense, but there's almost no source to it that I can identify, not one source.
I mean, maybe it links back to some of the moral panic around mugging and policing that Stuart Hall first outlined and others. And it links to a question from Lucienne about many of these issues ring similar to how the state conceptualizes antisocial behaviour. So how do we challenge the state's views of Black and minority ethnic young people as inherently problematic or anti-British? And I guess that's the challenge here.
I mean, I think one of the things we need to recognise is since 2010, there's been an extraordinary redistribution of resources away from young people. So instead of funding positive initiatives with young people, that is spending money on them, we spend money on agencies designed to control them. So one of the things, so I don't think schools are the, but what's the answer is just doing more for and with young people, much more engagement with them. So in a sense, it's as if we've become a community which has outsourced our engagement with youth. And one of the consequences of outsourcing your engagement with youth is it becomes officialdom that engages with youth and various kinds of authorities. And we've moved into a very centralized system. So it's very difficult for any group of parents to get access to a school, to raise issues with the school without being identified as troublemakers or worse, extremists and so on. So things which ought to be what any democratic community does is encourage debate within schools, debate between parents and other members of the local community with schools and so on. We've actually shifted from, we no longer encourage dialogue. We no longer think things will be settled through dialogue. We think they will be settled through a top-down process of officialdom. So I think it's quite extraordinary. We've lost the talent for living together, I think.
How we challenge the views, I don't know. But I think focusing on challenging the policies, at least in the first instance, is the way to go. You know, maybe if the Conservative government have certain views of my communities, I can come to terms with that. But if they have those views and then they have the policies and then they have the punitive and ideological forces of the state to enact violence through those views, then, you know, that is when it becomes a serious problem, and that's the place we're in. But to give a positive example, I don't know if people saw in the news last week, one issue I think Zahra alluded to in a presentation is the policing of hair in schools, the demonisation of black hairstyles, locks, natural afros, cornrows, a whole host of typically black hairstyles. And people have been pushing on that for a number of years, include young people, activists. There's been petitions. There's been an awful lot of pressure placed on individual schools and nationally. And it's looking like that might turn. There was a couple of high profile, there was some legal action by a couple of families that led to out of court settlements. And it was in the news last week that I think it's the Equality and Human Rights Commission, if I'm not mistaken, I've pushed this on again, and I think it's getting very close to a place where it's entirely untenable for schools to have these policies. I don't want to be naive about that, and you know, these kind of harms creep their ways back in if we're not vigilant. But that looks like a potential victory. Well, there's been small victories. It looks like there's potential for a bigger victory, a national victory on that shows how, you know, some of these policies can be overcome and therefore the harms can be prevented.
Great, thanks. It's good, as you say, it's good to have some positive developments to think about that. I'm going to turn to Nigel Ecclesfield, asks, to what extent should our concern for establishing safe and secure places for learning address the nature of teacher education and accreditation through the educational spectrum from early years through compulsory education and the post-compulsory sectors? So I guess that, yeah, this is a question about what can be done. There was a similar question maybe about curriculum. Oh, Adam North, yeah, does the curriculum play a role in racial policing in schools? So if you want to take either or and the question of training and curriculum. Zahra, would you like to start?
A question of, I think there's been more focus, in my opinion, on the curriculum than on teacher education. Maybe that's changing. And I would like to see more focus. Well, we need focus on both. We need multiple points of entry, we always say in our organizing, right? So policy is one, teacher education is one, curriculum is one, assessment is one. The management of relationships or how we nurture relationships, really, more than behavior. All of that, really. But in terms of what's going on with teacher education, we've gone from teacher education to teacher training to teacher instruction. So that's the direction of travel, taking it away from universities, all of which is really worrying. Institute of teaching, taking away really teacher education from critical spaces is really worrying, is really of concern. And we see similar assaults on the curriculum as well. So I think all of those things, abolition is about politics of and both. We need, it's not either or. There are so many. The terrain is so wide. There are so many spaces, and people need to, again, going back to Stuart Hall, like struggle where you are. What is the space that you occupy? What can you struggle, resist, affect change within and against? And I think, if your space is teacher education, that's where you work. If your space is curriculum, if your space is advocacy, if your space is policy, and then trying to get all those things in conversation with each other, because silos is, atomization is what destroys us. We know that everything is interconnected all the time.
Could you say a bit more about that shift from the teacher education, how the education of teachers has changed and what the impacts of that are?
It's why I'm not in the classroom, and it's so destroying, actually. And I don't want to, I know Remi was trying hard to bring positives into it, but it's one of the things that gives me great despair. But it is a site of struggle for us. It is something that we're trying to work on to intervene on. And there are some amazing educators that are trying to resist the assault on our critical consciousness, really. And so, I don't know what more I can say about that other than so teacher education, first of all, teaching is about relationships as a profession, and it's supposed to be a caring profession. So when you have taken the politics of care out of education, which is what I think the current carceral punitive policing logics that rule education, or are trying to be the ruling logic, do, I think that's a really important element that has to be resisted. Secondly, the fact that teaching seems to be reduced now to get in the classroom as soon as possible and throwing people in at the deep end without kind of giving them that deep understanding of, for example, child development, trauma-informed practice through an equity lens. Otherwise, we reproduce deficit discourses. Understanding of neurodiversity is really important as well. Nearly every child I encountered at the pupil referral unit had a disability or was neurodiverse, and never received, they were predominantly Black and brown, never really received an assessment for that. What they received instead was exclusion and punishment and pathology and criminalization instead of the support that they should have had, and the inclusive education entitlement that they should have had. So helping, all those elements should be part of teacher ed, in my opinion, and they're not.
And that's the initiatives like Teach First, where they put...
Yes, yeah, it is. And I wish more people understood the harm that these initiatives do, because taking teachers who supposedly have these top degrees, anyone can teach. I remember Michael Gove going, yeah, anyone can teach. Actually, I really strongly disagree. Not anyone should teach, is my opinion. Not everyone, should have the privilege to affect the lives of the most important people on the planet, in my opinion, which is children. So there's something fundamentally wrong about, getting teachers quickly as possible into the classroom. Oftentimes have nothing to do with the communities that they are inserted or parachuted into. So there's a real disconnect. And then minimal education, if you can call it that, in terms of how teaching is supposed to function, pedagogy, at its heart. And it's all about coping. And then we see the exodus out of teaching. And it's not surprising. And it's by design, because then those teachers don't progress, they don't become expensive, they don't go into retirement, they don't get ill, they don't become disabled. So in and out, and it's, you know, on that production line, which is what, you know, capitalism really does to education.
Thank you. I don't know, Remi or John, on teacher training or curriculum. That's been really helpful, though, Zahra. Thank you.
No, I just generally agree. And part of the problem is that it's not simply academies and academy trusts, but what comes alongside academy trusts is all the consultancies associated with providing training, whether that's in the form of short courses or in terms of, in a sense, representing teaching as an apprenticeship within a trust. I mean, and academy trusts are really separated from the communities that they serve. If one asks why, in a sense, the provision of education and resources for school children during COVID was so bad, it's because there was no, local authorities didn't have the involvement in all the schools in their area. They were divided up between trusts, and those trusts involved schools at quite significant geographical distance from each other. So as if the government imagined what it could do is pull a few levers to get things sorted, but they'd actually cut the wires attaching the levers through schools and local communities. So I think it's wrong for us to speak about community schools so long as we have multi-academy trusts. What we have is trusts delivering into communities regardless of whether the community likes the product, and I use that term advisedly, that the trust is seeking to deliver. So it's at best it's an efficiency model, but I doubt if it's really efficient. It's just, in a sense, doing what Gove said he was going to do at the start, and that was break the educational establishment, the so-called blob, as he called it.
Yeah, amazing to listen to Zahra and John on this. The only thing I would say is Vinnie Lander and Heather Smith have written on trying to push anti-racism into teacher education and the difficulties in that, and how absent it often is. Vinnie's written on that subject for a long time, but I know they've written some new stuff this year.
There's a couple of questions. Thanks, Remi and John. There's a couple of questions around policing more directly. So one is asking to what extent the police are still mining young Black people's identities. Luke Daniels, like date of birth for their racist database. I recently witnessed an incident where a young Black woman was asked for these details, although she was the peacemaker at the incident. So that's around the kind of gangs matrix kind of questions, I guess. But also Nicole Gibson asks about what does defunding the police mean? How can we better educate the public about what defunding initiatives are and what they mean to achieve? I don't know if Remi, if you want to come back on that.
Which one should we go with first?
I gave you two, so you'd have a choice.
Forgive me, but can you just briefly remind me? So the first one was about databases, right? Yeah. I don't know about the specific database that's being referred to, but I think we have to assume, or not assume, we can see that the police are always gathering information and increasingly technological ways, which is important. And Patrick Williams and Eric Kind have written some really interesting stuff on data-driven policing, and Patrick Williams and Becky Clark on gangs databases. But we can't, technology is part of the problem, data is part of the problem, the illusion of neutrality it creates is part of the problem, but we can't assume that the problem is only the technology, because if we look at community policing, for example, and we think about the role of community policing in Muslim communities with regards to prevent community policing is often put forward as like the nice, soft, gentle face of policing, but it's about intelligence gathering on our communities. It's about intrusion into our communities. There's a whole, if we think about spy cops, the police are an institution that gather information on us all the time. As technology advances, they'll increasingly do that. A particularly worrying aspect of it is the sharing of that data between institutions. The Racial Justice Network have put out a report today about the police use of fingerprint scanners, for which the information is shared with border agencies. So Black people subject to two incredibly pernicious stereotypes: the potential criminal, the potential overstayer. One scan of the fingerprint, and that information is shared between agencies with devastating consequences. So yeah, bleak answer, I know, but for policing, for borders, through education, information's being gathered on us all the time. And for activist communities, you know, we need to be much sharper on that stuff in terms of our security.
Yeah, I think in relation to prevent, it's very clear. I mean, there are, you know, two issues. One is the data that is collected through prevent. Obviously, if any of it related to offences, illegal actions, there would be criminal charges. So we know that all the material under prevent is non-serious information about individuals. But because prevent is attached to counter-terrorism legislation, the police are able to hold that information in effect for a lifetime. So even if they are required to monitor their databases, as you know, Mark Rowley has recently identified, the fact that somebody is identified as currently not a risk doesn't mean that their data will be removed. Their data just gets rolled over for the next review. So it's extraordinary. And this is data that can be shared from schools to universities in applications, and particularly in the context of moving between schools, getting access to being able to be taken on into a sixth form college and so on. So there are quite serious consequences for trivial kinds of reasons that people are reported. But you also have to ask the question, why does prevent operate within primary schools? Who is the target at primary? And there's something really insidious. That is a child, and what a child says at primary school, and if it creates you know, a concern in relation to prevent, who is being targeted are the relatives of the child, the parents or an uncle or something. So it's a really insidious process whereby children are subjected to quite, you know, dramatic interventions from counter-terrorism police at primary school age, and the target is family members and so on. So it's a huge, I mean, but it's them who are created, you know, with a, you know, on a criminal database and so on.
Thank you, John. I think it's about time to wrap up. I want to thank the audience for your questions and the panelists for what I think has been a really thought-provoking and challenging presentations. So just to say to the audience that you can find out more about Stuart Hall Foundation and Code on our respective websites. We both have newsletters and social media accounts which continue to give information on Twitter and Instagram. If you want to sign up to the next session tomorrow, we're talking about racial inequalities and activism. Wednesday is on housing and Thursday on healthcare. And they all start at 5 p.m. So thank you very much for joining us. This talk has been recorded and will be made available on our websites in the future. But I just want to finish off by thanking Remi, Zahra and John very much for your contributions. And I think that's it. We sign off. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.